Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a story that is honestly, it's absolutely staggering. We are talking about the rise and the inevitable, incredibly dramatic fall of the Mongol Empire. Think about it. A group of fractured, nomadic clans from the freezing plains of Siberia somehow managed to conquer the known world, and then lost the whole shebang. Okay, let's dive into this. The sheer scale of the Mongol legacy is kind of hard to wrap your head around. I mean, they're directly responsible for the rise of the Ottoman Empire. They spread gunpowder from China all the way to Europe. They even gave us the meaning of the word kamikaze. But how did they actually pull this off? How did a totally disorganized group of rival clans forge the largest contiguous land empire the world has literally ever seen, stretching all the way from Korea to Eastern Europe? And, perhaps the more fascinating question, why did such an unstoppable juggernaut eventually shatter into pieces?
Section 1. Forging the Mongol Empire.
To really understand this empire, we have to start with the man who built it from the ground up. Back in 1162, a boy named Temujin was born into a brutally harsh life in Siberia. When he was just 9 years old, his father was killed. His own clan abandoned him, leaving him entirely powerless. But instead of just fading into history, that betrayal sparked this intense, lifelong drive for vengeance and absolute power. Now, what's really interesting about this is how he entirely rewrote the rules of the game. You see, traditionally, Mongol clans operated strictly on nepotism. Your uncle might be a terrible general, but hey, he got the job because he was family. Meanwhile, a brilliant foot soldier would just stay a foot soldier forever. Temujin literally threw that system in the garbage. He built an army based purely on performance and competence. If you were a nobody, but you were a military genius, boom, Temujin made you a general. This created a system of extreme loyalty because his top people owed their entire status directly to him. By 1206, he was so terrifyingly competent that the other clans essentially just surrendered and crowned him the Great Khan of all Mongols, the Chinggis Khan.
Section 2. The Engine of Conquest.
So, with the clans finally united, this newly formed empire established two shockingly simple goals. First, absolute stability at home, which meant only Genghis Khan's direct family could ever sit on the throne. And second, total security on their borders. Now, the Mongol philosophy on border security was, well, pretty straightforward. Your neighbors can't invade you if you completely conquer them first. But they weren't just sending out armies to do this. They were sending out entire societies. The Mongols lived in what were called hordes. And a horde was a self-sufficient, nomadic moving city. We're talking tens of thousands of people here, soldiers, families, craftspeople, entire herds of cattle. Because Siberia lacks rich resources, they had to constantly keep moving just to find grass and game. And this constant movement made them incredibly resilient, tough, and entirely independent. They didn't need supply lines, because their supply line was literally traveling right along with them.
And when they conquered a neighboring tribe, they didn't just tax them, they absorbed them. They used this brilliant Turkish-inspired assimilation playbook. Step 1, conquer the tribe. Step 2, force the survivors to join the Mongol horde. Step 3, and this is the really clever, kind of insidious part, they dictated exactly where you pitched your tent. They made sure you were entirely surrounded by Mongol neighbors, completely separated from your old friends. Then, step 4, with literally no one around to practice your old culture with, it was naturally erased. Your kids grew up speaking Mongol, acting Mongol, and ultimately becoming Mongol warriors themselves.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why they were so devastating militarily, especially when they took on massive, technologically advanced superpowers like the Great Jin Dynasty in China. Think about traditional armies in the 13th century. They simply could not fight in the winter. Without modern supply lines, stationary armies literally starved in the snow. But the Mongols? Well, they were born in the freezing Siberian winters. They attacked in the dead of winter when the enemy was completely paralyzed. They had extreme mobility, they could forage under the snow, and if an enemy army did somehow approach, the Mongols would just ride away on their horses, shooting arrows backward. It was an unstoppable tactical advantage.
But, an empire needs an economy, right? And the Mongol bureaucracy ran on this ingenious, self-sustaining loop of plunder for loyalty. They would start a war, take the plunder, and bring that immense wealth back to Mongolia. But because they were nomads, they couldn't just hoard chests of gold. They couldn't carry it. So the Great Khan distributed the plunder down the chain of command to all his loyal subjects. This meant that to keep your people happy and loyal, you constantly needed more plunder, which meant you constantly needed to start new wars. It was an engine that could only run by constantly expanding.
Section 3. An Empire Divided.
Of course, that endless expansion eventually hit a mathematical wall. In 1227, Chinggis Khan died, leaving behind an empire stretching from the Caspian Sea to China.
It was simply too vast to manage from a single nomadic tent. To manage this staggering array of completely different global political systems, the empire was eventually divided into 4 main regions, or khanates, all overseen by the Great Khan. But over the next few decades, the empire spent years fighting these vicious civil wars that were basically disguised as political elections. Eventually, a leader named Kublai Khan took power, but the rest of the empire just flat out refused to follow him. So by 1266, the unified Mongol Empire completely fractured into 4 distinct blocks: the Yuan Dynasty, the Golden Horde, the Ul Khanate, and the Chagatai Khanate.
Section 4. The Fall of the Khans. Now here is where we enter the final act, and the incredible dramatic irony of the whole Mongol story. The very thing that made them unstoppable, geography, actually engineered their individual downfalls. Over in the east, Kublai Khan founded the Yuan dynasty in China. He was a conqueror looking for a target, and he set his sights on Japan. Just listen to this staggeringly arrogant letter he sent to the Japanese. "You stupid little barbarians, do you dare to defy us by not submitting?" Wow, it perfectly captures the supreme confidence of an empire that had literally never lost. But Kublai Khan was about to learn a very harsh lesson about the limits of horsepower. The sea was the one terrain a horse just couldn't conquer. When the Mongols finally invaded Japan in 1274, and then again in 1281, massive typhoons destroyed their fleets entirely. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, or heavenly wind. With their outward expansion halted by the ocean, the Mongols had no new plunder. To get money, they were forced to stay in China and rebuild the Chinese infrastructure for tribute. But to do that, they needed Chinese bureaucrats. Over decades, the Mongols slowly abandoned their nomadic ways and essentially became Chinese. By the 1350s, a series of plagues and floods hit, and the starving citizens realized the Mongols were just taking tribute and giving absolutely nothing back. A massive civilian revolt chased the Mongols right back out into the steppes in 1368.
Let's move on and see how this builds completely differently in Eastern Europe with the Golden Horde. Now, the endless Russian grasslands were absolutely perfect for the Mongol hordes. They were perfectly poised to conquer all of Western Europe. They crushed Poland, they crushed Hungary, but then the Great Khan died back home, and they literally abandoned the invasion of Europe to go hold an election. No way, right? After that, dense European forests and swamps totally stopped their momentum, so they just turned on each other. Fighting over resources, the Mongol clans started relying on native Russian princes for troops and alliances. Over the centuries, the Mongols basically killed each other off in civil wars, while the Russians quietly built up their wealth and power. In 1480, united under Moscow, the Russians easily rebelled and threw off Mongol rule entirely.
Meanwhile, down in the Middle East, the Il Khanates was living through an absolute geographic nightmare. The Mongols thrived in wide open spaces, right? But the Middle East forced them into narrow desert passages, completely ruining their legendary mobility. Even worse, and this is wild, their famous horses were entirely terrified of the camels used by Arab armies. Plus, major cities like Baghdad didn't have enough surrounding grasslands to feed a massive horde, which led to starvation and intense internal fighting over resources. When the Black Death swept through in the 1330s and wiped out the royal family, the entire Il Khanate simply crumbled by 1335.
Finally, we have the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. They actually lasted the longest, grazing their horses on the vast central steppes. But over 500 years, the world advanced, creating a devastating technological shift. The unstoppable Mongol weapon was the horse archer. But then, the musket was invented. Think about it, you need 2 hands to reload an early firearm, which means you gotta get off your horse. Suddenly, stationary soldiers with lethal, long-range firearms completely neutralized the fast-moving Mongol archers. Technology rendered their entire way of war totally obsolete, and they were finally conquered by China in 1755. Which brings us to a fascinating final thought. The Mongols conquered the world precisely because they were rugged, hypermobile nomads who relied on no one but themselves. But to actually rule the world they had just conquered, they had to stop moving. They had to rely on Chinese bureaucrats, Russian politicians, and Middle Eastern cities. So ask yourself, was settling down to rule the world the very thing that guaranteed they would lose it? It's an incredible historical irony, and it leaves behind so many fascinating successor empires, from Russia to the Mughals, that we are definitely going to explore in future explainers. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this incredible history.